I'm Esther George, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City.
네,
In late August
캔자스시티
each year since
연방은행의
1982,
총재래요.
the Kansas City Fed has been honored to welcome
이거는 뭐
central
별 얘기
bankers,
아닙니다. 우리가
policymakers,
열어서 영광이다.
academics, and others to Jackson Hole, Wyoming for our Economic Policy Symposium. After hosting a virtual conference last year, it was our hope that we could convene in person this week. And that seemed a reasonable plan before local health conditions changed. I regret the inconvenience of this last-minute pivot to a virtual format and want to express my thanks to our partners at the Jackson Lake Lodge and many others in the Jackson Hole area for working with us for months to make preparations and accommodations. So virtually, we will open the program today with our first speaker, Fed Chairman Jay Powell, whose remarks will be broadcast to the public. Following that, the remainder of the program, titled Macroeconomic Policy in an Uneven Economy, will continue for invited guests. As always, the full agenda and each of the papers presented will be posted at our public website, kansascityfed.org, and a transcript of the symposium will be made available after the event. Now, it's my distinct honor to welcome Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell. Chairman Powell, I want to thank you for your flexibility in these circumstances. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Esther, and good morning.
음질이
17 months have passed since the U.S. economy faced the full force of the COVID-19 pandemic. This shock led to an immediate and unprecedented decline, as large parts of the economy were shuttered to contain the spread of the disease. The path of recovery has been a difficult one, and a good place to begin is by thanking those on the front line fighting the pandemic. The essential workers who kept the economy going, those who have cared for others in need, and those in medical research, business, and government who came together to discover, produce, and widely distribute effective vaccines in record time. We should also keep in our thoughts those who have lost their lives from COVID, as well as their loved ones. Strong policy support has fueled a vigorous but uneven recovery, one that is, in many respects, historically anomalous. In a reversal of typical patterns in a downturn, aggregate personal income rose rather than fell, and households massively shifted their spending from services to manufactured goods. Booming demand for goods and the strength and speed of the reopening have led to shortages and bottlenecks, leaving the COVID-constrained supply side unable to keep up. The result has been elevated inflation in durable goods, a sector that has experienced an annual inflation rate well below zero over the past quarter century. Labor market conditions are improving but turbulent, and the pandemic continues to threaten not only health and life, but also economic activity. Many other advanced economies are experiencing similarly unusual conditions. In my comments today, I will focus on the Fed's efforts to promote our maximum employment and price stability
글자 잘 안
goals
보이시나요?
amid this upheaval, and suggest how lessons from history and a careful focus on incoming data and the evolving risks offer useful guidance for today's unique monetary policy challenges. The pandemic recession, the briefest yet deepest on record, displaced roughly 30 million workers in the space of 2
화질을 안
months.
올리신 것 같은데.
The decline in output in the
일단
second
시작이
quarter of
좋지 않네요.
2020 was
아직도 상황이
twice the
좋지
full
않다.
decline during the Great
아,
Recession.
테이퍼링을 안 한다는 소리일 수도 있겠구나.
But the pace of the recovery has exceeded expectations, with output
선물 시장
surpassing its
뛰었네요.
previous peak after only 4 quarters, less than half the time required following the Great Recession. As is typically the case, the recovery in employment has lagged that in output. Nonetheless, employment gains have also come faster than expected. The economic downturn has not fallen equally on all Americans, and those least able to shoulder the burden have been hardest hit. In particular, despite progress, Joblessness continues to fall disproportionately on lower wage workers in the service sector
불공평을
and on African
강조를
Americans and
하네요.
Hispanics.
히스패닉.
The unevenness of the recovery can further be seen through the lens of the sectoral shift of spending into goods, particularly durable goods such as appliances, furniture, and cars, and away from services, particularly in-person services in areas such as travel and leisure. As the pandemic struck, restaurant meals fell 45%, air travel 95%, and dentist visits 65%. Even today, with overall GDP and consumption spending more than fully recovered, services spending remains about 7% below trend.
서비스 섹터 회복이 매우
Total
느리다고
employment
합니다.
is now 6 million below its February 2020 level, and 5 million of that shortfall is in the still depressed service sector. In contrast, spending on durable goods has boomed since the start of the recovery and is now running about 20% above the pre-pandemic level. With demand outstripping pandemic-afflicted supply, rising durables prices are a principal factor lifting inflation well above our 2% objective. Given the ongoing upheaval in the economy, some strains and surprises are inevitable. The job of monetary policy is to promote maximum employment and price stability as the economy works through this challenging period. I'll turn now to a discussion of progress toward those goals. The outlook for the labor market has brightened considerably in recent months. After faltering last winter, job gains have risen steadily over the course of this year and now average 832,000 over the past 3 months, of which almost 800,000 have been in services. The pace of total hiring is faster than at any time in the recorded data before the pandemic. The levels of job openings and quits are at record highs, and employers report that they cannot fill jobs fast enough to meet returning demand. These favorable conditions for job seekers should help the economy cover the considerable remaining ground to reach maximum employment. The unemployment rate has declined to 5.4%, a post-pandemic low, but is still much too high, and the reported rate understates the amount of labor market slack. Long-term unemployment remains elevated, and the recovery in labor force participation has lagged well behind the rest of the labor market, as it has in past recoveries. With vaccinations rising, schools reopening, and enhanced unemployment benefits ending, some factors that may be holding back job seekers are likely fading. While the Delta variant presents a near-term risk, the prospects are good for continued progress toward maximum employment. The rapid reopening of the economy has brought a sharp run-up in inflation. Over the 12 months through July, measures of headline and core PCE inflation have run at 4.2% and 3.6% respectively, well above our 2% longer run objective. Businesses and consumers widely report upward pressure on prices and wages. Inflation at these levels is, of course, a cause for concern. But that concern is tempered by a number of factors that suggest that these elevated readings are likely to prove temporary. This assessment is a critical and ongoing one, and we are carefully monitoring incoming data. The dynamics of inflation are complex, and we assess the inflation outlook from a number of different perspectives, as I will now discuss. The spike in inflation is so far largely the product of a relatively narrow group of goods and services that have been directly affected by the pandemic and the reopening of the economy. Durable goods alone contributed about 1% to the latest 12-month measures of headline and core inflation. Energy prices, which rebounded with the strong recovery, added another 0.8% to headline inflation. And from long experience, we expect the inflation effects of these increases to be transitory. In addition, some prices, for example, for hotel rooms and airplane tickets, declined sharply during the recession and have now moved back up close to pre-pandemic levels. The 12-month window we use in computing inflation now captures the rebound in prices but not the initial decline, temporarily elevating reported inflation. These effects, which are adding a few tenths to measured inflation, should wash out over time. We consult a range of measures meant to capture whether price increases for particular items are spilling over into broad-based inflation. These include trimmed mean measures and measures excluding durables and computed from just before the pandemic. These measures generally show inflation at or close to our 2% longer-run objective. We would be concerned at signs that inflationary pressures were spreading more broadly through the economy. We are also directly monitoring the prices of particular goods and services most affected by the pandemic and the reopening, and are beginning to see a moderation in some cases as shortages ease. Used car prices, for example, appear to have stabilized. Indeed, some price indicators are beginning to fall.
테이퍼링
If
없다고
that
보고 있나
continues, as
보네요.
many analysts
선물시장은.
predict, then used car prices will soon be pulling measured inflation down, as they did for much of the
이건
past
제
decade.
생각이고.
This same dynamic of upward inflation pressure dissipating and in some cases reversing seems likely to play out in durables more generally. Over the 25 years preceding the pandemic, durables prices actually declined, with inflation averaging negative 1.9% per year. As supply problems have begun to resolve, inflation in durable goods other than autos has now slowed and may be starting to fall.
인플레
It seems unlikely that durables
상당히
inflation
적게
will
보고
continue
있는
to
게
contribute
큰
importantly
문제가
over
아니라고
time
보고
to
있는.
overall inflation. We will be looking for evidence that supports or undercuts that expectation. We also assess whether wage increases are consistent with our 2% inflation goal over time. Wage increases are essential to support a rising standard of living and are generally, of course, a welcome development. But if wage increases were to move materially and persistently above the levels of productivity gains and inflation, businesses would likely pass those increases on to customers, a process that could become the sort of wage price spiral seen at times in the past. Today, we see little evidence of wage increases that might threaten excessive inflation. Broad-based measures of wages that adjust for compositional changes in the labor force, such as the Employment Cost Index and the Atlanta Wage Growth Tracker, show wages moving up at a pace that appears consistent with our longer-term inflation objective. We will continue to monitor this carefully. Policymakers and analysts generally believe that as long as longer-term inflation expectations remain anchored, policy can and should look through temporary swings in inflation. Our monetary policy framework emphasizes that anchoring longer-term expectations at 2% is important for both maximum employment and price stability. We carefully monitor a wide range of indicators of longer-term inflation expectations. These measures today are at levels broadly consistent with our 2% objective.
인플레가 별
Because
소리
measures of
아니라는
inflation expectations are
소리는 이미
individually
나왔던
noisy,
얘기고
we also focus on common patterns
테이퍼링에
across the
대해서는 아직
measures.
얘기가 안 나오네요.
One approach to summarizing these patterns is the board staff's Index of Common Inflation Expectations, which combines information from a broad range of survey and market-based measures. This index captures a general move down in expectations starting around 2014, a time when
일단
inflation was running
선물시장은
persistently below 2%.
네,
More
굉장히
recently, the
높게
index
오르고 있죠.
shows a welcome reversal of that decline and is now at levels more consistent with our 2% objective. Longer-term inflation expectations have moved much less than actual inflation or near-term expectations, suggesting that households, businesses, and market
결론을 얘기를 안
participants
하네요.
also believe that current high inflation readings are likely to prove transitory, and that in any case,
또
the
똑같은
Fed will
소리입니다.
keep inflation close to our 2% objective over time. Finally, it is worth noting that since the 1990s, inflation in many advanced economies has
5,000원
run somewhat
감사합니다.
below 2%, even in good times. The pattern of low inflation likely reflects sustained disinflationary forces, including technology, globalization, and perhaps demographic factors, as well as a stronger and more successful commitment by central banks to maintain price stability. In the United States, unemployment ran below 4% for
똑같은
about 2
얘기하고
years
있는데
before the pandemic.
인플레이션 별거
while inflation
아니다라고
ran
하면서
at or
뭐
below
다양한
10%.
자료들을 보여주고
Wages
있어요.
did move up across the income
연관
spectrum.
자료들 보여주면서
welcome
인플레이션은 큰 문제가
But
아니고
not by
연준이
enough to
관리할
lift
거다.
price inflation
우리
consistently to
목표인
2%.
2%로 만들 것이다라는 얘기를
While the
계속하고
underlying
있습니다.
global disinflationary factors are
뭐
likely
딱히
to
영향가
evolve
있는
over
얘기는
time,
아니라서
there is little reason to think that they have suddenly reversed or abated. It seems
네,
more
감사합니다.
likely that they will continue
유튜브도
to weigh on
구독해 주시면
inflation
너무 감사할
as
것
the
같아요.
pandemic passes into history.
근데 늘 이런 식으로 얘기하더라고. 했던 얘기 또 하고 또 하고 또 하고.
incoming inflation data against each of these assessments. To sum up, the baseline outlook is for continued progress toward maximum employment, with inflation returning to levels consistent with our goal of inflation averaging 2% over time. Let me now turn to how the baseline outlook and the associated risks and uncertainties figure in our monetary policymaking. The period from 1950 through the early 1980s provides two important lessons for managing the risks and uncertainties we face today. The early days of stabilization policy in the 1950s taught monetary policymakers not to attempt to offset what are likely to be temporary fluctuations in inflation. Indeed, responding may do more harm than good, particularly in an era where policy rates are much closer to the effective lower bound even in good times. The main influence of monetary policy on inflation can come after a lag of a year or more. If a central bank tightens policy in response to factors that turn out to be temporary, the main policy effects are likely to arrive after the need has passed. The ill-timed policy move unnecessarily slows hiring and other economic
주요 통화
activity
정책을
and
바꾸면
pushes
안
inflation
된다라고
lower than
얘기하고
desired.
있습니다.
Today, with
테이퍼링 안 한다는
substantial
소리
slack remaining
같은데요.
in the labor market and the pandemic continuing, such a mistake could be particularly harmful. We know that extended
테이퍼링 안
periods of
한다는
unemployment can
소리는
mean lasting harm to workers and to the productive capacity of the economy. History also teaches, however, that central banks cannot take for granted that inflation due to transitory factors will fade. The 1970s saw two periods in which there were large increases in energy and food prices, raising headline inflation for a time. But when the direct effects on headline inflation eased, core inflation continued to run persistently higher than before. One likely contributing factor was that the public had come to generally expect higher inflation. One reason why we now monitor inflation expectations so carefully. Central banks have always faced the problem of distinguishing transitory inflation spikes from more troublesome developments. And it is sometimes difficult to do so with confidence in real time. At such times, there is no substitute for a careful focus on incoming data and evolving risks. If sustained higher inflation were to become a serious concern, the FOMC would certainly respond and use our tools to assure that inflation runs at levels that are consistent with our goal. Incoming data should provide more evidence that some of its supply-demand imbalances are improving, and more evidence of a continued moderation in inflation, particularly in goods and service prices that have been most affected by the pandemic.
대충 얘기 끝난 것 같습니다.
We also expect to see continued strong job creation. And we'll be learning more.
지금 얘기를 한 게 인플레이션이 일시적이다라는 얘기를 계속했어요. 위에서 인플레이션은 별 문제 아니다라고 바닥을 깔고 두 가지 중요한 레슨을 배웠는데 1950년대 통화 정책으로 일시적인 문제, 즉 인플레이션이죠. 인플레이션을 해결하기 위해서 통화 정책을 바꿀 수는 없다. 그래서 인플레이션은 자연적으로 사라지지 않기 때문에 우리의 연준의 노력이 필요하지만 우리는 그걸 반드시 해낼 거다. 즉 테이퍼링은 하지 않는다 라고 보입니다. 네, 아직까지는 그렇게 얘기했는데 좀 더 들어볼게요.
our maximum employment and price stability goals measured since last December when we first articulated this guidance. My view is that the substantial further progress test has been met for inflation. There has also been clear progress toward maximum employment. At the FOMC's recent July meeting, I was of the view, as were most participants, that if the economy evolved broadly as anticipated, it could be appropriate to start reducing the pace of asset purchases this year. The intervening month has brought more progress in the form of a strong employment report for July, but also the further spread of the Delta variant. We will be carefully assessing incoming data and the evolving risks. Even after our asset purchases end, our elevated holdings of longer-term securities will continue to support accommodative financial conditions.
와, 하겠다는 거야, 안 하겠다는 거야.
The timing and pace of the coming reduction in asset purchases will not be intended to carry a direct signal regarding the timing of interest rate liftoff, for which we have articulated a different and substantially more stringent test. We have said that we will continue to hold the target range for the federal funds rate at its current level until the economy reaches conditions consistent with maximum employment and inflation has reached 2% and is on track to moderately exceed 2% for some time. We have much ground to cover to reach maximum employment, and time will tell whether we have reached 2% inflation on a sustainable basis. These are challenging times for the public we serve,
끝났습니다.
as the pandemic
안
and its
한답니다. 네, 그래서 참 말 오래 하네요. 지금 몇 분 한 겁니까? 거의 뭐 30분을 했나? 네, 끝났습니다. 뭐 앞에 이렇게 깔았어요. 인플레이션은 뭐 일시적이고 큰 문제가 아니다. 그래서 뭐 우리는 이런 일시적인 문제, 인플레이션을 위해서 통화 정책을 바꾸지 않을 것이다. 7월 때는 이제 하는 것이 적절하다고 생각했는데 결론적으로는 목표 실업률, 최저 실업률과 2% 목표 인플레이션에 도달할 때까지는 자산 매입 규모를 줄이지 않겠다라고 얘기를 했습니다. 네, 여러분들 가시기 전에 구독 한 번만 해주시고, 네, 제가 유튜브 하고 있는데 이게 녹록지 않아요. 제가 진짜 맨날 운동하고 와서 3-4시간씩 공부해서 올리는데 안 알려줘서 너무 힘듭니다. 좀 구독과 좋아요 해주시고, 끝난 건 아닌데 이제 파월 의장 얘기가 끝났으니까 라이브는 끄도록 하고요. 네, 구독과 좋아요 해주시고 여기저기 소문 좀 많이 내주시고, 제가 중요한 이벤트 있을 때마다 이렇게 라이브 하고, 또 제가 공부하는 것들, 뭐 좋은 주식들, 섹터들 있으면은 추천하겠습니다. 네, 오늘 그래도 깔끔하게 잘 끝났네요. 저는 하방 보고 있었는데 그래도 TQQQ 주주니까 네, 우상향 할 거라고 믿습니다. 네, 여러분들 한 300여 분 가까이 와주셨었는데 감사합니다. 이 영상은 녹화해서 또 보실 수 있도록 남겨놓도록 할게요. 네, 늦었는데 여기 계신 분들 열심히 공부하시는 거 보니까 진짜 멋집니다. 다들 성투하실 거라고 믿고 스트림을 깔끔하게 여기서 마치도록 하겠습니다. 네, 모두들 좋은 밤 되시고, 구독과 좋아요, 알람 설정, 여기 아시죠? 알람 설정 뜨죠? 해주시면 더 힘내서 더 열심히 공부하고 네, 좋은 소식들과 좋은 정보들 드리도록 하겠습니다. 네, 감사합니다. 모두들 성투하시고 부자 되세요. 좋은 밤 되세요.